I've gotten 3 different requests this week from people on asking how to make their violin cut through a mix. Now, if I had a nickel for every time a string player complained about a sound engineer, I wouldn't have to make these videos anymore. So let's make a video. I'm an electric violinist and I'm a front of house engineer. I work both sides of this equation on a regular basis. And I will say that the complaints that string players have about engineers, they actually go the other way too. So it's probably better if we both understand each other a little more and try to understand what job the other one is trying to do. By the way, it's not just violinists who want to know how to cut through a mix. Guitar players are always talking about this. In fact, the Boss Katana amp series is named after a sword because guitar players are always talking about how do I get my guitar, how do I get my tone to cut through a mix. I want people to be able to hear me when I'm playing. One of the things sound engineers talk a lot about is sonic space, and we're talking about the frequency spectrum and really about who is living in which parts of that spectrum. If I'm mixing a big band, like a worship band or something like that that's got bass, drums, a couple of electric guitar players, an acoustic player, a keyboard player, string players, multiple singers, tracks, all that stuff, it's all about who is going to be where. Each instrument or each track cannot have access to the full sonic spectrum. Each instrument by itself is going to want to take up more sonic space than it's rightfully entitled to in such a big ensemble like that. Think about bass guitar. I've got low frequencies there from the fundamentals on those strings, but then I've got overtones, I've got fret buzz, I've got finger noise, I've got a huge sonic spectrum that I've got to try to get as much of that into the mix as I can while still preserving space for other instruments. Each instrument's going to have to be carved up a little bit in order to make space for the other instruments. The front of house engineer can do it, or the players themselves can do it, both with the way that they manage their own tone and with arrangements, just the way they're playing, whether they're trying to play the same things at the same time as other people. Here's why it's better if the players do it, or at least start the process. When you send me a signal at front of house, the first thing I do is adjust my input gain to turn you up as high as I reasonably can before you start clipping. I have input meters that show me how much signal you're sending, and I use that meter as a guide. Low frequencies take up a ton of sonic space. They also carry a lot of energy, and they're going to push that meter pretty high. If you as a player cut those low frequencies before they even get to me, they're not going to hit that meter, and I'm going to be able to turn you up louder before you start clipping. I'm probably going to cut all those low frequencies anyway. Guitars, basses, kick drums, toms, synths, keys, they all get to live down there. Fiddle players don't. But if you're relying on me to make those cuts come after that meter and after that head amp. So I've already allowed all that space, all that low frequency stuff to come in, and then I'm cutting later, which means you could have been turned up higher. That's one reason that you might hear your engineer tell you, I just can't get you up in the mix. You're sending a ton of energy that they're cutting out and they can't use, and what's left just isn't strong enough to get out there. Now, if I ask 100 violinists whether they prefer a rich, dark, warm tone or a thin, bright, crisp tone, probably 90% of you are going to say you want the first one. Now let's listen to a rich, warm, dark, full tone all by itself. It sounds nice, right? But guess where that is if we look at that on an RTA? That's a lot of low mids, which is right down where vocals and guitars and keys and all that want to live. Now I'm going to change the EQ on that instrument, make it a little thinner, a little brighter, and a little crisper. If we look at a spectrum, we can see a big difference between those two. Now you might prefer the darker, fatter sound all by itself, but let's listen to how they sit in a mix. Here's the darker, warmer one in a mix with a bunch of other instruments first. Now here's the brighter, crisper, thinner one. Now, for the record, those two signals have the same maximum level. They're hitting my meters equally hard, which means that's where I would have had one set. Notice that one of them seems louder and it's easier to hear. Now, from an EQ perspective, I boosted some 1K and some 4K, going from the first sound to the second, and I cut a bunch of lows out. You can also boost a little 6 or 8K if you want. Be careful, all of these frequencies are a double-edged sword. We're kind of looking for that Goldilocks spot where we don't have too little, we don't have too much. Talk to your sound engineer as you're making some of these adjustments about which one is better for them in the mix. If we're doing most of the cutting, it stops them from having to do it. And we have more control over our tone, and we can make artistic choices that we like better because we know what we want our instrument to sound like. They don't. Now, there are options other than just EQ. We can add some overdrive. Let's listen to a little bit of overdrive just by itself. Now, you may say that that's actually got a little more of an electric, distorted sound than I want. Let's listen to that in a mix, though. That's actually a lot more friendly than you would think, right? Right off the bat. And it lays nice in a mix. And again, this is the same level as the other signals that we heard. And that's poking through that mix real nice, but it retains kind of a warm characteristic. Overdrive is technically distortion. And distortion does two things. It compresses and it adds high frequencies. Compression is cool because it allows us to turn things up because it's knocking the peaks off a signal. Remember, I talked about that input meter. I'm looking at what your maximum level is as I'm trying to set that knob. If your peaks are lower, I can set that knob higher because you're not hitting my meter as hard, which is allowing the rest of your signal on average to be louder. Now, the downside of overdrive is that if you play a lot of double stops, they can start getting a little crunchy, especially on thirds. They start getting pretty noticeable. If you're mostly playing single note lines, a little bit of overdrive might fatten up your tone and help it cut through both, which is a little counterintuitive. Now, not all overdrives and distortions are created equally. You'll have to do a little bit of experimenting to determine which one is right for your context. Let's listen to another sound. This one is going to be not with an overdrive pedal, but through a tube amp. Now, again, you might think, gosh, that's adding quite a bit of distortion, and it sounds kind of like a little bit like an electric guitar. Let's listen to what it sounds like in a mix. Now think about the fact that the guitars, and if they're running some Hammond organs and all that stuff, all of those things have some distortion on it. And in fact, a lot of the vocals will have some saturation on there, which is a small amount of distortion. If you're running totally clean and everybody else has got a little bit of distortion in there, you may kind of poke out in some sonic ways that you're not expecting. When you add a little bit of distortion or saturation to your signal, it may help kind of glue your instrument into the mix and make it feel like it's, oh, this one is like the others. We don't have one of those, one of these is not like the others kind of situations where you're not poking out because you're louder, you're poking out because you're kind of different. Be aware that your tone may sound a little thinner in your ears than what you're used to hearing. especially if you've been practicing with some of these big fat tones at home. Remember, this is that second tone that we use with a brighter EQ. And that's compared to the first warm, round, fat sound we had. If you have some parts during the night that are going to be unaccompanied and you want that fatter, rounder sound because there's not a whole lot of stuff around you that you're trying to cut through, you may want to create some separate presets or some separate stomp box settings where you can let that fat tone come through in your solo sections or your unaccompanied sections and have that brighter tone that cuts through the mix when you're playing with a bunch of other people. Remember, in an orchestral setting where you are playing music that was written for you by composers, the composer had to think about all this as they were orchestrating this piece. How are the oboes going to be heard here? We've got to get the violins down, or the trombones. What are we going to do with them? So if you're playing in a pop band or a rock band or a worship band, you're not used to having to think about these things. The composer used to do that for you. Now that you've got control over your tone and you've got control over what you play and when, these decisions kind of land on you. So it's a new universe for a lot of you. I understand that. And that's we want to have you some information about how to make my tone thinner, brighter, cut through better, not occupy the same space as guitar players. And if you make those decisions before the engineer gets the tone, the engineer is going to have less carving to do, and they're maybe going to be less likely to make decisions that you wouldn't approve of.